All right, so we are live. I just want to give special shout outs, even though they may not want me to two people who have generously donated in honor of this class, and that is Elisa and Andy. Thank you both for your generous donations and sponsorship of this class. The classes are free, and no one should feel any obligation to pay, but we are really grateful, especially as our donations at the synagogue have, you know, kiddushes, bar mitzvahs, weddings, they're not happening. So, so if anyone wants to, do feel free to hit up our website, which is in the chat with a donate button right there. You can always do it in honor of this class, but there's no pressure or guilt, especially as 40 million people are unemployed and the economy has taken a downturn. You may not actually have money to donate, in which case we don't want your money. And if you need money, and a separate matter, the Jewish Alliance is fundraising money for people in need, even people that weren't in need before. And you can go to a local rabbi to gain access to that. So the opposite also, if you're like, actually, I can't give you money. In fact, I can't pay for dinner. If that's where you're at. So either way, speak to me. If you're just rolling in the dough, speak to me and we'll announce your name. And if you're the opposite, great. And if you're somewhere in between, that's also great. And with that, we'll jump into the text. You can tell I don't do fundraising.
So subtle.
Oh, you want a donation?
I thought we'd look at the verse in Yeshayahu that's going to be the subject of the discussion, just that we're not imagining what is it that we're talking about scripturally, and it'll help us. This is the verse we've been talking about for a while. Se'u marom einechem u're'u mivara ela. That's been like the last 4 weeks. Lift your eyes on high and see who created these things. And we focused on who a fair amount. And then we focused on these. Then we combined who and these into Elohim. And we said that who created these really isn't talking about God per se. And it's not talking about these things, the celestial objects per se. It may actually be making a more fundamental point about asking the question, who created the things that allow for existence to exist? Now we're moving on in the verse to Hamotzi b'mispar tzva'am. He brings them forth b'mispar tzva'am, by the number of their legions. Legions, like, I guess, either a military unit or a large number of stars kind of idea going on. Lechulam b'shem yikra. He calls each one by its name. Each one of what? Presumably it's the stars. Merov onim va'amitz koach ish lo nedar. Because of his, or from his great might and tremendous power, no one of them fails to appear. Like, there's not a star that just isn't there, as it were. This is in it's the conclusion to one of the Haftarot, one of the Haftorahs. Okay, so that's what we're going to be working with today, this pasuk from Isaiah. And so if you need it, there it is. You can also put the link to
Rabbi,
it in case you want to reference it when we're not sharing it in the chat as a sort of.
Rabbi, it's Michael.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you can see me, but I have been thinking about this verse and how it is. It seems when you ask the question, me, you're supposed to be so awestruck by creation that you think somehow into big things. And pardon me, I'm not a mystic. I'm trying to learn about this. But what if the starting point were who created the first tongues that were created, supposedly created on the eve of the first Shabbat? A small thing, but we wonder, how would we ever have gotten to where we are now? But it's just a small thing. Can I start from there and do this exercise, or do I have to think in cosmic terms in order to start out?
Right. Okay, that's a really Good point. So I'll quote here Rav Kook from his diaries. And Rav Kook, seemingly influenced, though there's no evidence of this, by Buddhists, actually cites the opposite example, and he quotes the verse, which is similar. Bichal derachecha de'ehu says in Proverbs, in all of your ways, know him, know God in all of your ways. And the Maimonidean approach to this verse, know God in all of your ways, this is a great question, is that whenever you're doing anything, Maimonides says, you should think to yourself that like there's a God, essentially. In other words, that I'm here, but that God is commanding me and doing these things, and I'm in a substructure of existence from the deity. But Rav Kook actually says that, getting a little feedback from someone.
Background noise, please mute.
Yeah, we'll mute all. All right. So Rav, thank you, everyone. So, but Rav Kook actually says you should do the opposite of the Maimonidean approach. You shouldn't think while you're doing a thing like, oh, there's God, but rather you should be so absorbed in the thing that you're doing fully that actually the thought like God has created this tea that I'm drinking, that thought distracts me from the experience of drinking the tea. It's a distracting thought that removes my presence from that action. And actually, B'chol derachecha, in Rav Kook says, betoch, in the middle of the things that you're doing, know him. And so he actually says that he uses the example of drinking tea as his example in his diary. I think meant there to be a trivial thing or a small thing, as opposed to cosmic things that Maimonides is talking about. And so probably they're both approaches, right? I will say that on an experiential level, because that's what we're talking about now, that I regularly am going out for walks at night now because there aren't like, I used to be out at night doing events, but now there aren't events at night because there's nothing. So I go out for walks at night. And there are a few streets in Oak Hill where there aren't even so many streetlights. And you could tell as it gets shades darker, like that many more stars appear. And the dark, if you go to like darker spots, the sky starts to get, and there have been some beautiful nights lately. And it actually is pretty, removing ourselves from the main verse, I personally find something extremely calming about being placed in a vast universe, probably in a multiverse, right? But also, just there is something incredible about the night sky, which humans for most of millennia regularly experience, which we would have to like actually physically travel to have a version of that experience because there's so much light pollution. I sometimes wonder if we're on lockdown, why don't we just close all the streetlights so we could at least see the stars? Wouldn't it be nice? But look, here we are locked down, but we don't even get the benefit of the heavens fully. So that's a thought. It's not a deep thought, but I think it's probably both, if that would answer your question. I think there's something extremely valuable about getting lost in the cosmos and having that be an entry point to even deeper questions that are metaphysical as opposed to physical. But probably there's a spiritual way in which small personal experiences, the smallest, are no less reflective of this reality and perhaps more useful as a regular practice, right? Because most of our time is not spent dreaming in the cosmos. It's spent in the mundane, it's spent in Zoom rooms now, right? So is that responsive or not, Michael?
I'm not quite finished, but I'm not going to hold up the class. Please proceed.
Okay, can we, offline, can we continue?
We can continue. Please continue with the class.
Okay, so thank you. So Amar Rabbi Shimon, Mikanu lahala shlimu dikra dichtiv hamotzi b'mispar tzva'am. Train dargan inun schmutz on my screen. The istrach lemeve rishim kol chad minayhu. Chad da di'it marma v'chad mi. Da ilah v'da tata. Da ilah rishim v'amar hamotzi b'mispar tzva'am. Hamotzia hu dish demoda v'leit kavate. Kigavna da hamotzi lachem min haaretz. Hamotzi ahu de'ishtamo da dargatata v'kol echad. Okay, we'll go to the. So, a lot here. Rabbi Shimon said, from here on, Shlimu Dekra, the completion of the verse. As it is written, the rest of this verse, Su'u maromen nechem ura'u mibar elah, hamotzi b'mispar tzva'am, the one who brings forth their array by number. These are two runs, each of which should be inscribed. One is what, and the other who. This is above, that is below. The one above is inscribed by the words, the one who brings forth their array by number, the one who is known beyond compare. Okay, so here, the one who brings forth mi bara elah, who brings forth the things? That's the question. Who is it? It's who. That's what we said the last couple of weeks. It's the sense of awe. It's the unknown, the unknowable God who orders the universe. It's binah. And as we might recall, binah is this aspect of emanation, which is the thing that gives structure to the rest of emanation. It's the first level that we can relate to from below, but we can only relate to it in its unrelatability. Yes, it's the thing we can question, but never comprehend. And from its end, that's from our perspective. And from its perspective, this distinction I'm making from our perspective versus from its perspective is how the Shla, Rabbi Yeshai Levi Horowitz, thought it was useful to think about Kabbalistic terms, to think about them, what he called mitzidenu, first from our perspective, and then mitzido, from his perspective. So I think that can be a helpful way to distinguish in thinking about these concepts if you're trying to think about them in your mind clearly. I often revert to that framework. From our perspective, binah is comforting, healing, the source of miracles, the source of rest, Shabbat, other things. It's a source of exodus, like exodus from Egypt from above. It's the thing that helps you when you're stuck. It removes you from Egypt, which is a narrow place. It's the unexpected. It's the winning the spiritual lotteries of life is binah from our perspective. And it's unknowable in a certain sense. But from God's perspective, yes, this is a participant waiting. Binah is not really unknowable. It's actually God's wisdom fully manifest in this world a little more. It's the thing that creates structure, the thing that creates order, the thing that creates metaphysical rules. And then ultimately those things lead to physical rules. So it's the source of the metaphysical rules of our universe, or of this emanation of existence, is binah, if that makes sense. Is that helpful? And these things are one and the same.
Quick question.
Yeah.
I see the note says it's binah, and you've explained that it's binah, but the text itself doesn't say binah. So how are we to know that? Like, where is that derived?
Like, why reading this, and all the commentaries I'll add. So when I prepare for this class, I look at a handful of famous commentaries. I would say the Sulam, which is the one I was copying the Hebrew from originally, most, because that's a classic Lurianic commentary. So that's how Isaac Luria, who, by the way, died in a plague, it's worth noting, in Sfat. I think about, the great figures. Probably the leading mystic of the Kabbalah after him. Most of his way of reading the Zohar is encapsulated in the Sulam. It's somewhat complicated. Why is everyone reading it like that? Everyone's reading it as binah. That's not always true. Sometimes the Mat reading or other readings are taking a position where actually there's some amount of debate as to what it's referring to. But here there isn't. So why is that? So hamotzi b'mispar tzva'am is taken to be, just in the verse, a cognate. I don't know if that's the right word for mi bara elah. In other words, look and see who created these things and who created them. The verse does give an answer. Hamotzi b'mispar tzva'am, the one who brings forth these things by their number. So hamotzi, the one who brings forth, seems to be equated with me just in the verse itself. They're like, think who created these, the one who brings them forth. The verse is sort of answering the unanswerable question with this word. And so this word hamotzi must be talking about binah. Does that make sense? That's from the like. Now, about this, this one is both known, but beyond compare. Those are both important. Known implies that we know something about it, right? And so there's something we can say about it, like to Rachel's question of what should I say the class was about. You can say something. There's something you can say. But beyond compare implies a little bit, maybe not the opposite, but is in tension with that idea. Like what we know is that God is beyond compare, that there's like the God we know is maybe unknowable is the right word, but there's all of language. And so this is part of what the Zohar is getting at. I think it's fair to say that all of language is in a sense a metaphor. Anytime I use, I don't know if linguists would agree with me, but I think most would. Not being a real linguist, others could chime in here. Whenever I use a word to describe a thing, I'm using a construct, language, to describe some other actual thing. And that would be true even of mathematical equations or other things. We're using representations to represent specific things. And so all language is in essence a sort of metaphor. And so God is known. Binah, we can use language to represent something of what binah is, this sense of awe at the creator who orders this incredible existence. But beyond compare, there aren't really good words that can describe this because there aren't many useful comparisons because there's no other thing like this. The higher we get up on the rung, the more we're getting to a God that is Ein Sof, that is undescribable, or that may overlap with the sort of negative theology of Maimonides and others in a certain aspect, or perhaps Sufi mystics, this notion that like at some point, the higher up we get the ladder, there's absolutely nothing we can say. So here we're saying something, but God is beyond compare. That like we're at a high level, and so there's not like many things we can say God is like. Similarly, the one who brings forth bread from the earth. So now they're making an interesting link. And early on, you may recall we did a teaching about the Zohar and Kiddush, and holding like a Kiddush cup or a Havdalah cup, and the rose and the 5 fingers from below the cup and what that could represent. And so here is the teaching kind of on hamotzi. It's the parallel teaching. Take them together and you have like the Zohar's teaching on the Shabbat table almost. So the reason they're thinking about hamotzi lechem min haaretz on the blessing who brings forth bread from the earth is partially just the style of learning being lyrical and associational. So hamotzi, the one who brings forth. Well, we have that word as a major part of our liturgy, hamotzi. And so we jump there. But there's more than that to it. Hamotzi lechem min haaretz is the most tangible manifestation of a physical thing, bread. It like grows out of the ground. It's the paradigmatic food. It feeds human beings who then, burn the food for energy and excrete the rest, right? It's like it's not lofty in that sense. Here we're talking about shechina, or the lower rung. Note 2 things. They both start with hey. And here we're working with the tetragrammaton, yud, hey, vav, hey. So we said before, last week, at the beginning, that yud, the first letter of God's name, represents chokhmah, the sphera of wisdom. And hey, the first hey in God's name, represents binah. It's open. It's often considered like a womb. In that metaphor of it, yud, a point, is considered like a masculine object, and hey, binah, is considered a feminine object. Vav, the next letter, has the numerology of 6 and often is seen to represent 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, this Tiferet complex, as it were. It's often just called Tiferet, but meant to represent Chesed, Gevura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, and Yesod, sometimes all of it. Sometimes referred to by the Ari by the name Zeir Anpin, the small face of God. An interesting thing we can talk about for this complex of things. So, what have I said? So, hey is Bina. But hey, the hey word, and the word ha-motzi, who brings forth, also starts with hey. So this gets to your question a little, Andy. How do we know that it's talking about Bina? Also the hey at the beginning of the word, me, the word me, who, describes Bina. But the letter hey is the part of God's name that references Bina. And the first hey. But the second hey, in hamotzi lechem min haaretz, is the final letter of God's name, Malchut. And so what you have here is this interesting thing. It's the same letter, the second name and the second letter and the fourth letter of God's name are the same letter. So there's something identical about those aspects of God in their femininity, in the sense that they tangibly give birth to structures that produce life, right? These Malchut and Binah are seen as parallel, or as we described them last time, as mother-daughter looking alike. And we had a daughter, like a mother dressing her daughter for her wedding day, waiting for us to come on pilgrimage to be the knights in shining armor, right? Okay, digressed. So when we say similarly, kigavana, this is a move of the Zohar often, to say that certain things are beyond compare and other things are similar, are like this. The Zohar loves making this comparison, often the Aramaic word kigavna, in this way, in this manner. So just like there's Bina above, similarly, the one who brings forth bread from the earth, this blessing of hamotzi, is a blessing about the tangible manifestation of things in the world. Note something that's, and it also represented by the letter hey in the blessing hamotzi. Also, the blessing, hamotzi lechem min haaretz, that whole blessing, has 10 words in it, which the Kabbalists understood to relate to the 10 sfirot. There's more about it, which is that bread is a thing that people have a heavy hand in making. Maybe this is the teaching of sourdough starters, since they're becoming very trendy these days. Everyone is making sourdough. I love sourdough, and sourdough was what bread was before people put yeast in bread, which was relatively recent from what I understand. But bread isn't a naturally occurring product. Like, God doesn't make bread. People make bread, and they have to create some kind of fermentation process in order to do it, and they have to grind the wheat. And actually, the Sidura de Pas, the steps involved with making bread, of harvesting and threshing and grinding and all of that, forms the basis for a whole bunch of the 39 prohibited labors on Shabbat. So it's very human involved. So I'll open it up here. Of what significance is it that the thing they're talking about to represent shechina, or the divine presence here, is actually a blessing for a food that is only made by a fairly technological human process? This is a discussion point.
Well, we had the idea last time of that humans complete the divine task of creation in one or more senses, and that allows God to ultimately manifest his godliness, right? So that we're in partnership with God, even in God's own full manifestation. So this kind of echoes that a little bit, right? That it's the same entity who brings forth the array, who brings forth the bread, but the bread is brought forth clearly, as you were saying, in cooperation with us, or by our means, by our mechanism. So this nicely mirrors, I think, the point from last time.
Yeah, so this does form a sort of parallel with the teaching last time about Aliyah L'Rego, right? In that sense of it's our coming and making pilgrimage, which excites the divine sefirot and causes the full embodiment, or in that case, the adornment of Shekhinah, sort of getting her in the wedding dress and putting on the makeup in that wedding metaphor. So here too, it's our making bread and reciting the blessing on it, actually, from below, which is the same force which brings things forth. So that is, yes, a theme that I think is reverberating here. Now, the one who is known, the lower rung, right? So who is the one who brings forth bread from the earth? The one who is known. That God, this emanation of God is known. I'm saying, in what way is this God known? You know, people don't have theological questions about knowing God here, but no, it means tangibly manifest. Maybe this is an answer to your question, Michael, in the smallest of things, right? This is the manifestation of God in every moment, in moment-to-moment existence, as opposed to in sort of cosmic thinking. And the lower rung, and all is one, kol echad, all is one. So this comment is a short one, but is really important. It's not, it's giving instruction for a yichud, for a unification. So it's, whenever we say something like all is one in the Zohar, it's alluding to this notion of unifying things. So what does it mean all is one? On a plain level, it means that the hey of binah is the same as the hey of shechina. Right? That the hey of God's upper emanation is the very same as God who manifests here. We're not talking about different gods, and actually they're the same letter, hey and hey. There's nothing different. It's not the higher hey and the lower hey. They're not written differently. They're written the same hey. But what we really mean is sort of speaking about the difficulty, or speaking to the difficulty or the mystery of emanation itself, which is how do we take an infinite God and manifest that God in a tangible universe? This is the question of theodicy, or of the tzimtzum, this notion that God retracted for. How do we emanate a God is the question the Zohar is trying to figure out. Like, how do we go from God to stuff? How do we create? Which is the question of Breshit. How do we do it? So the Zohar here is sort of actually saying, well, one of the ways you do it is by joining hey and hey, by joining the notion of giving spiritual structures to the metaphysical universe, or the inner life of God, is comparable to giving physical structure to the spiritual reality of actual existence, or of making bread. To see those tasks as not dissimilar. There's a sense of mystery in all of them, of asking about them, the question me or ma, but also a sense in ordering them, of calling them by name. Binah mitzido, from his perspective, gives structure to it. And hamotzi lechem in ours, just the act of reciting that blessing to us, ascribes a creator to the things we make. And suggests a spiritual order to our ordering or creation of things, and to our technology. And so God creates technology, and kigavana, like that, entirely incomparably, but similarly, we create technology. And so this is speaking about human productivity as well, and the notion of people ordering with meaning, structure, and balance being the key feature of it. And in those similarities, actually, kol echad, all is one. So not just God's name becomes unified, but all things become unified. And that's often the goal of this sort of teaching, is to create a link where we move from you might ask, why would I want to feel entirely unified with all other things? And you could do this on different levels. You could say, why would I want to feel the same as all other people? Like, maybe I want to feel, and this is a topic that is also, I think, of import in sort of philosophies of social justice. Like, do I want to feel victimized and different and no one can describe my experience accurately? Or do we want to say that actually, no, there's great commonality between experiences and sort of human understanding? It's true in comparative study of religion. Alan Brill writes about this a fair amount. Do we want to say that anyone's religious experience is sui generis to that category of religion, and another person can't really describe what it is? Reb Soloveitchik felt this way, and so he felt interreligious dialogue was very limited. The Catholic experience of God and the Jewish experience of God are different. The Sufi experience and the Sunni experience are different, and there's nothing to talk about. Or no, is it universal? There's one thing that's being experienced, and so if it's a Jewish unified meditation, or it's working in a Hindu system, but ultimately there's one reality. And so it's different parts of the elephant in the metaphor of some of them. People are feeling different parts of the elephant, but there's still one elephant. It's true in evolutionary psychology, looking at things in different ways. Right? Some people want to talk about, well, okay, I've made enough saying too much. So,
can I just make a comment?
Yeah.
I'm struck by the parallel, and obviously they didn't know about it, with our understanding of the universe today as being somehow a unity of energy and matter, that those are interchangeable. You know, this idea that binah in the upper world of, you know, divine energy funnels down to our world of physical things. I mean, the parallel is striking in some ways, even though historically we know that, you know, they weren't Einsteins. I'm just making that comment. You know, on the one hand, we can talk about it as you did, Rabbi, in a personal, spiritual way. But I think they're also talking about a description of the entire cosmos as one in some way, even though its manifestations seem to be radically different. You know, like the old Cosmos series on TV that some of us remember, that we're all star stuff. So the question you asked, what's the point of our feeling that we're part of the one? Is there some kind of spiritual message in the almost scientific message that matter, energy, all of us, somehow in its root has a kind of oneness to it that we only see from our perspective as separate? Just
He went mute. I think he's done.
I'm done.
Yeah.
Right. So the question, you know, the interesting question I'm having in response to that really insightful question is, you know, right. So E equals mc squared is obviously talking about like a physically tangible form of energy. And here they're talking about some metaphysical form of energy. And so actually, I'm wondering how literally we can take what I'm going to call Confer's equation for the moment, that hey to hey, binah to malchut as a yichud, may be more or less equivalent to the notion of E equals mc squared as a mathematical matter. Because part of me says, well, no, E is describing energy and it's just a representation. Yeah, I don't know.
No, I weigh in with one point on that. I mean, energy within physics is an incredibly abstract notion. You just called it, I think, tangible energy versus metaphysical energy. But energy is extremely abstract and it shouldn't be called physical. So I think it's closer than you were suggesting by, you know, by
that's what I'm wondering, right?
Yeah.
Energy, like what is energy? As we describe it as mc squared, which like, what is that? Like,
right. Energy can manifest itself in very different forms, including matter or light or even potential energy versus kinetic energy. And these have nothing physical in common, essentially. So I think in seeing energy as abstract, you can consider it a kind of spiritual thing, which then manifests itself in matter and many other forms.
Right. I mean, and then we can get into questions.
Confer's equation works very nicely.
So I think Confer's equation here rivals Kramer's equation, the equation that may or may not have been attributed to the Vilna Gaon. There's a Kramer's equation in mathematics, and some people claim that the Vilna Gaon, wrote that. So why would we want to do this? I happen to think, but people are welcome to chime in, just a personal thing. Like, there's enough difference in the world and emphasis on difference. And actually, we go there enough ourselves as primarily egoistic kinds of beings. Like, it's easy to get lost up in our own physical existence, my problems, my life, my schedule, my stress, such that any opportunity to come to unity is a welcome counterweight to the very fact of existing. Like, we already have an individualistic bias, I think, not just societally, perhaps ingrained as a survival thing, or maybe metaphysically. It's just the way it is. And so this is always a good thing to be going to. You know, some people might express a fear of a danger of being like too universalistic or too going here too much. I think maybe that might be something about why you'd want to do it or not. people have more to say about
I
that.
think we could have a very long conversation on this subject, which I don't know that people want to have. It's a fascinating, deep thought. I have a question which may or may not be related to it. And if it's not related, please just say, bracket it and we'll talk about it later, which is when we were talking about the 4-letter name of God in this context, I'm struck by the fact that the hey is repeated, right? So the first hey you said is binah, and then you never actually said what is the final hey also just binah, but that would
It's
so not,
shechina.
it's
Shechina. So the final
shechina,
hey
final hey. Okay.
is let me stop my how do I get out of my annotation? Here we go. So here is but the thing stayed. So erase it. Well, anyway, so here is hey 1 and here is hey 2.
Okay. So certainly that makes more sense, because the idea that God's name would be repetitive and have a redundant element just doesn't fit in with our, Jewish worldview, right? So each piece is distinctly meaningful. But I wonder if that also connects to this passage, which is the starting point of this discussion. Like the 2 hey, in fact, it does exactly, right? The first hey is the upper rung and the second hey is the lower rung.
Yeah. And what's interesting, kol achad, they're both hey. Like they're not different letters. So in the end, they're both different letters because one is the second letter, one's the 4th letter, but they are the same letter.
Or
and so,
to put that differently, it's the same thing that manifests itself in 2 different ways, which is, of course, Kampfer's equation, right? The energy.
yes.
Right.
Yes. So Rachel, just so you know, when they asked what this was about, we were explaining Kampfer's equation.
I think she left, but that's too bad. So she missed what it was all about.
Oh, no. Okay. So, okay.
I don't know if the comment was that profound as to name it Kampfer's equation.
If you're uncomfortable with
Too
the
late.
name, I'll take it if you don't want it.
Universe is not only an ancient concept, but a modern concept in some other manifestation of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, by that most of that was commentary on and all is one, which probably is the equals sign in Kampfer's equation. Now, by number, 600,000 standing together, generating forces according to their kind beyond number. So, Hamotzi b'mispar tzva'am, the upper binah, brings forth things. So what are those things? What is their number? It says brings them forth by their number, and the plain verse is talking about the stars, but we know that we reinterpret that as binah created the metaphysical structures of the Godhead or the spiritual world of God, the inner spiritual life. So what is it? What is the things by number? If they're not stars, God is one. There's like a real question here. If God is one, and we just said all is one, then how could you bring forth things within God by number? That is like heretical. So now we're asking a question about that, if it makes sense. And so we say, well, 600,000, and 600,000, what that is a way of taking these sfirot, chesed, gevura, tiferet, netzach, hod, yesod, multiplying them all by 1,000 as a representative of infinity in this context. 1,000 not being like, it's not each one of them is 1,000, so we have 6,000. The sense is taking 6 things and making them 6,000 is a way of saying they're huge. Or 100,000 or whatever we did, 600,000 is a way of just making them giant, making them infinite. And saying the sfirot is what was generated, 600,000 and their forces. But of course, this number is going to relate to Israel soon, because the number of male Israelites in the desert, according to the Torah, is 603,550, which is approximately 600,000. It's close. So there's going to be a representation there. Now, in multiplying them by 100,000, they're doing something that the Ramchal talks about a lot. The Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, was an Italian Kabbalist and poet, philosopher, romance writer, all kinds of things. And he got in trouble. He had to flee to Amsterdam because he was too adventurous in his dabblings. And he wrote a dialogue between a choker and a mikubal, between I guess sort of like a professor and a Kabbalist, as a play. And one of the issues they get stuck on is that the choker the professor tells the Kabbalist, the Christians have 3 gods, and you made 10. That's the accusation by the professor. Like you're worse than a Trinity, and that's not meant as an offense to Christians, by the way. I'm like for many different religions, whatever. But that's the way the question is asked in that book. And so the Ramchal spends a lot of time justifying the 10 Sefirot. He was alert to that criticism among rationalist Jews, right? That this sounds polytheistic. As saying, well, no, each of these things is sort of infinite, and ultimately it's just God chose to manifest in these ways, and so it's a way of God's manifestation, but ultimately it's Ein Sof, it's indescribable, sort of the way he's out of it. One of the things he emphasizes is that each of these things, even once we're under binah, we can understand them. We know what loving kindness is. We know what it looks like to be kind. We know what it looks like to be strong. We know what it looks like to balance our kindness and our strength. Those are all knowable things that we can talk about easily. But by multiplying them by 100,000, we're noting that God's quality of loving kindness, while understandable, is still fundamentally infinite. Does that make sense? So that's part of why the number is growing, in my opinion. That's what we're doing by saying it's like 600,000. We're saying that these qualities of God that binah creates, which are ordered, are still infinite, and calls them each by name, both the 600,000 and their forces. What does this mean by name? So what do you mean by name? Like the stars, we get a sense that God cared about each star. Like he knows intimately the vast array of the cosmos in a way that we can only know a limited number of people so intimately, but God can know infinite numbers of stars infinitely. But once we change this to the Sefirot, what does it mean to call them by name, b'shem? The Sefirot. So if you say they were called individually named, not so, for the verse should read by its name. Rather, as long as this one had not ascended and was still called me, who it did not give birth nor bring forth what was hidden, each according to its kind, though all of them were hidden within. Once it created Elah, these, and attained its name, Elohim. In other words, there's only one name in the verse. It should be V'chulam b'shemot yikra, as it is in other places in the Psalms, by their names. But once we say by its name, we're implying one name. And which name? By God's name. So what happened? We're playing with this notion of multiplicity and singularity in God. God created through his name manifestation, through this name. So it's interesting here because Elohim, it's not that God calls these Sefirot names. It's like through attaining a name, these things emerge. Now, what's in a name? I always wanted to say that. Like, what is in a name?
Well, this name has a Yud Hey and a Vav Hey in it, so it's got a lot.
Right, and when here we're actually talking about the name Elohim specifically, I think.
True. Okay.
So a different name even. So like, but what's fundamental, like in the concept of a name?
What's in the concept of a name? That's the general question you're asking?
Yeah, and well, so like, yes, that's the question I'm asking.
It'd be like qualities of someone. I mean, one of the famous, like one concept of vidui is to change your name. So the idea that your name actually has certain qualities or confers upon a certain, it's more than just what you're called. It actually has something to do with your inner nature.
Okay, so the first thing we've got is like something about you, who you are, or this Jewish idea that like names are derivative of a prophetic instinct when they're given.
Well, names are descriptive might be another way of saying that point, right? Names describe what you are, as opposed to merely refer to you. But you're looking for more, right? So mastery of a name, in the ancient world was thought to give power over the thing named somehow. So names would have this magical forces associated with it.
Good. Okay, so I had 3 things in mind. One of them was about the essence of a thing. One was about the power or mastery over a thing. Thinking of Adam calling the animals all by name when he's first created, right? Is this sort of way of saying he's got dominion over stuff, that he's calling them by names. But one is an externality. This Zohar, and here the Hebrew is actually helpful, is using the word de'ishtemoda a lot. Hamotzeahu de'ishtemoda, to be known, to be revealed. God wants to be revealed. That part of a name is that you're going to interact with someone who is not your name. Does that make sense?
I was going to actually say that when you think about a name, whether it's for a person or anything, it's both limiting and unlimited. So what do I mean? So it's limiting because whether your name means something or reflects something, immediately that's what people are going to think of when they hear your name. But it's unlimited because it can now be shared. You can now be shared with an unlimited number of people. Does that make sense? Like God's name.
Right, the name can...
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Right. Good. And I'm thinking now of this interesting study they did where like people named Carpenter, for example, are more likely to be carpenters, even selecting for the bias that like probably if your last name is Carpenter, you had someone in your ancestry who was Carpenter, that makes you more like, even if you account for that likelihood, you're still much more likely to be a carpenter, or if your name is Blue, you're much more likely to buy a blue house or paint things blue. And those things happen. And so a name does limit you, both in terms of how you're known, but also maybe even like subtly and psychologically, just hearing the name has a resonance, which you're kind of getting at. Like your name says something and has a meaning, which either it's prophetic or it's self-defining or both, but it's there. And it can be, right, we can all refer to Shakespeare and know what we're talking about, even though we're really talking about a name and none of us met Shakespeare or really have a sense of Shakespeare as a person. So this name of God is that, right? All of those things. But in particular, it's to be known or to be revealed. And that's, I think, what they're talking about here in this back and forth, is that God, by creating this, was able to develop a name. That is, to have a name to be called by people or creations, right? So this is how God comes to be known. And while God is me and me alone, even though me, binah, contains the elements of all the things that will, right? Because binah is the deep substructure within it. It's 49 that are 50 gates. It's the place where all of the sefirot emerge. But until they emerge and combine with me and descend up in that kind of interaction, there's still nothing for us to know. So it's still all in potential.
Does bestowing a name have some sense of bringing something into creation itself? I think that was a concept we covered a bit before. So the idea that like it exists because I call it a name, or in this case, it was created through the calling of the name.
Right. Not unlike the beginning of Bereshit itself, which is what we're commenting on, where, right, God calls, right, he says, it's 10 sayings, and he says, you know, Yehi or vayhi or, let there be light, and there was light. God just says it, and it is so. Or as we say, Misha Amar v'haya olam, he who said and the world was. So there's this sense of that, and there's a sense from below, right? God calls the name and creates things, and when we call the name Elohim, right, what are we doing? We're empowering that in a sense, not just referencing it, but actually fully manifesting it, which was the teaching of like the last time. But so it does relate to this magical quality. By saying the name God, in this case Elohim, we are actually calling forth or completing, as it were, God's statement of his own name. That is inherent in this. Anytime they're talking about names of God, they're very conscious of the fact that we say these names in our prayers. And so this is part of what gives sort of magical or theurgic power to prayer in a Kabbalistic context. This is the meaning of calls them each by name. By its very name, it called forth each and every kind to exist perfectly, referencing Bereshit. But it's not that God here called the things to exist. It's rather God created a name, and that name had to emanate this sort of world. You know, it's not like a chance that God willed it. Will, in the chart of the Sefirot or Ratzon, where God just decides on a thing, is up here. This is Ratzon or will, right? But here we're already into like a very specific notion of God, that God is self-created. God is limited himself by his name that he's known by, as it were. And these things called to create a very specific sort of world that has to emerge from these things. I don't know if that point is.
So we have two simultaneous namings occurring in Bereshit, which is that God, by naming things, brings them into being, as I think Joe was suggesting, right? Let there be light, and then use the example, let there be light. By calling that name, light comes to be. But this very same action is what's also bestowing God's name upon him, because at this point, me joins with these and becomes Elohim, right?
Yeah, and actually further, it's almost if Vayomer Elohim Vayior shouldn't be read that way. I don't know that the Zohar is reading it that way, but it almost is. It's almost as if Vayomer Elohim. It's almost as if instead of and God said, it's like as if God said God's own name. And actually that put the chain, that was the thing that started the chain reaction. All God said was God's own name. God didn't say those other things that said God said. God only said God's name. In other words, he doesn't call the stars by name. He doesn't actually create things. All God needed to do was create God's self. And once God created God's self, everything else just emerged. Because the whole nation of God creating his own name means he has to be known, and he has to be known by things. And that necessitates the whole chain reaction that results in creation. So actually,
that fits better with this current passage, just because, as you were saying earlier, when that phrase, God calls them each by name, this passage is saying that doesn't mean he named each individual thing. It means he calls them by his own name, right? That's how you were reading this a few lines ago. So that all sort of fits nicely and gives a nice different way of understanding those first lines of Bereshit, right? Which sounds like he's saying, let there be light. But in fact, what he's just saying is, Elohim over and over again, or something like that.
Yeah, and Michael.
But that verse about that he calls them all by name.
Yeah.
I thought that was intended to say that, well, God's really way beyond us because he knows not only he can count all the stars, he knows them all by name.
Right. No, that's the plain. The
he
plain
knows
reading
much
is
more than we do. So how are we going after this infinite type of knowledge?
The plain meaning is God. You can't keep up with your inbox. Well, God knows every single star of the gazillions of stars, personally, and is their good friend and their buddy, all of them and everything. Right. So yes, that's the plain meaning. And the Zohar is radically reinterpreting and saying that's the plain meaning of the verse. But actually, the real meaning is the opposite, that God doesn't need to know a lot to know things. God only needs to call his own name. Or another way of saying this, which will be provocative, I hope for you, is that our knowledge of things tends to be external. I know about things, whereas God knows things by knowing God's self, because he created them and they're within his existence. So God's act of knowing things is an act of self-knowledge, as opposed to, like you by knowing about yourself, you don't know about me, but by knowing about God's self, God knows about everything. So God only needs to call his own name. Where this gets even more radical, though, is that it takes what I just said and it flips it around. Because once God calling by God's self, God's name brings forth everything, then actually everything is just a manifestation of God. Or as Uncle Moshe said in his hit song, Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is really everywhere. If God is everywhere, or everyone is a spark of God.
My kid's favorite song, by the way.
What?
My kid's favorite song.
Yeah, no, a classic. So if that panentheistic notion of things is true, then actually your knowing yourself well could be a spiritual path to knowing all other things, because you're part of that unified whole. So that was in a sense, we're actually dealing with the controversial idea that chelek Eloka mimal, this idea that every person contains a spark of God above, a Hasidic notion that they took very seriously. It's part of this teaching also. But how seriously do we take that? If God's self-knowledge is what produces all things, and we're actually an important part of bringing that into full manifestation, well, is our self-knowledge a way of linking with all other things? Or to get to Michael Goldenberg's question at the very beginning, do I have to have knowledge of the cosmos? I'm going to reframe your question, not about big things and small things, but about internal things and external things. Can I know about God? If I want to pray, do I think about the stars and the planets and the cosmos, or the metaphysical stars that are the sphirot? Or do I dive deep within my soul and my emotions, thoughts, and experiences as a way of entering this world? What's the door? What's the pathway? And the Zohar is reversing the pathway. That's what it's doing in rereading the verse, taking a bird's eye view, in my opinion. This is at least what I wrote in my prep notes that I'm reading now for this year that I wrote. And I think it is actually more true now that we've done it. It's saying, you thought you relate to God as the creator of these celestial objects, but actually you can relate to God who knows God's self by name in an internal way, right? You can relate to God by, as Rav Kook says in the introduction to his Siddur, by delving into the corridors of your soul. That's the term he uses. So by delving internally, it becomes a path of connection. I
have one small question there. In your response to Michael, you said that's the plain meaning of text, but now this is the real meaning. Could they don't have to be exclusive, right? It can, both the plain meaning can be correct and the deeper the deeper meaning or the symbolic meaning.
Right. Not only don't they have to be exclusive, probably they have to be non-exclusive.
Right.
Which is to say that, yeah, they're both true in different ways. And this is just highlighting the surprising or subversive reading of the text that undermines this deeper meaning does tend to undermine the plain meaning in a certain way. They're not just different, they're intention, and they're both true. But I think that that's part of the Zohar's playfulness, is that it takes the verse which says God knows all these stars well, and actually says God knows only himself well, because it says name.
Yeah.
Does that
one hit? Go on.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Michael.
Michael, then Andy.
Does that mean that if I follow this methodology and I really learn it well, that I will be able to name all the stars, or at least think that I can?
How much power does this give you to alter the universe? So obviously there are different schools of Kabbalah, theosophic and theurgic, which has been written about. Some people studied Kabbalah only to have a philosophy, a different lens on life, and that lens would imbue life with a sort of meaning and perhaps different action. Whereas there were for sure many Kabbalists, maybe most Kabbalists, that thought that by doing this well, you can manipulate the levers of the universe by playing God, because you're in fact part of God. So God is no longer this entity that you're subject to, but you're both subject to God, but also part of God. And
Well,
so
which kind are we learning here, Rabbi?
I don't qualify how we learn things, but I'm not a theurgic Kabbalist. I think in a modern context, it's more helpful to view Kabbalah as a lens on life than otherwise, because I think that the dangers of superstitious religion, maybe danger is too strong a word, but in a modern context, superstitious religion can lead to a sense in which science or other things which in this system are valuable or super valuable are ignored. And I think I'm scared, and I think the coronavirus highlights some of these things for me. I'm scared about where really theurgic superstitious religion can go for its role in asserting superiority to science and being in conflict with it in ways that I think aren't natural to Kabbalah, but you could easily go there from this.
So we can't just play with amulets to get rid of the virus? Is that
right? That's what I'm saying, right? We shouldn't play with amulets. We should listen to Fauci, our amulet. And so,
and Rabbi, to take a step back, you were claiming that human participation in the three festivals, human participation has some effect on the cosmic, I don't know, plan or existence. I mean, what was that point you were making last time about, oh yeah, there's some connection between what we do below and what is happening above. So how do you separate that? And I agree with you, the jump beyond the line into magical theurgism.
Yeah, I think that's an open question. We'll open up. I don't know that I have a good answer to that question off the top of my head, but I do think that there's a balanced understanding that what is a tangible question? And we actually, maybe I'll say this in, I think, a way that I hope would make Maimonides proud is, maybe, I don't want to invoke Maimonides, but point here is, I think that an ordered understanding of what is here, namely a scientific or mathematical one, with all of the recursive improvement built into those systems, is the most organized, detailed, and therefore best understanding of how to partner with God. In other words, partnering with God involves not just action, but not just well-motivated action, but here I'll invoke the Buddhist concept of right action, of doing things correctly. And actually, it's much easier to do things correctly, embracing what we know about epidemiology and virology than ignoring them and pretending we know nothing. And that's actually an insult to the empowerment we've been given by God in the sphere of shechina, and results in a form of, I think, religious laziness. So that would be my answer, but I acknowledge people might have different answers.
I just wanted to insert one tiny historical note that this idea that God knows the world by knowing himself was prominently developed by Averroes, medieval Islamic philosopher who was a contemporary of Maimonides. So I'm wondering, are the Kabbalists who are writing this assuming it's being written in the, what we say, 13th century-ish or so?
Right, yeah.
They're familiar with, he was a very prominent Islamic philosopher. Maimonides, I think, knew of his work, wouldn't have known him didn't know him personally. But I wonder if it's being written in the 12th, 13th century, that idea is in the air,
Oh, right. Oh, and really interesting, right? And were there, and Averroes was in Islamic Spain?
Yeah, I think so. He actually might have been like in the Ukraine, actually, like
oh, really?
The far reaches, I could be wrong here, of the Islamic Empire at that time.
But query, where was Averroes? But like this is being written in Spain, and so if Averroes is anywhere in the area, for sure, then
that would undermine my thesis. Yes, but there was also the Jewish philosopher Narboni. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he also adopted this idea in about the 14th century. So. And he might have been familiar with the Kabbalah at that point, or certainly, but with Averroes' writing. So it's a fascinating idea. I actually have to run, so I'm going to head out. Thank you. I'll see you next time.
All. Yeah, no. So I think that's a logical conclusion anyway to this week's thing. So maybe we'll spend 5 more minutes if anyone has comments or questions. Well, you know what? There's 2 more lines. We'll do them. Similarly, see, I have called by name Bitzalel. Bitzalel is the person, do people have 5 minutes? Bitzalel is the person who makes the Mishkan, right? He's the designer, the artisan who designs. So it says, I have called Bitzalel Bishem in Exodus, by name. So the plain meaning is, I've selected Bitzalel to be the chief designer of the tabernacle and its accoutrements. But I mentioned my name. The reread here is Bishem. No, I mentioned my name so that Bitzalel would attain perfect existence, his great might. So no, I didn't single him out. Actually, I just said my own name and Bitzalel sprung out. Here's like now who is Bitzalel and what is the Mishkan and what is, we said last time that the Aron, the ark, which is in the Mishkan, it's where it's housed, is Yesod. In this is like the ark, and this is the stuff that's in it, the Torah and the tablets and that kind of thing, right? That, or do we say the opposite, right? Yesod becomes like the covenant, the brit. So here we just have another example of I've called my name, and here sort of emanating that fully, like Bitzalel, the person that gives space, malchut, to God's covenant appearing. So this is just like in their minds, a version of the same teaching. The verse then says, Merov Onim, right? His great might. What is this? First of rungs to which all desires ascending there secretly. So just to end the teaching, right? All desires, this is a Kabbalistic idea. Every time you have a desire, God has desire for good, and we have desires down here, like I want a cookie, or I'm tired, or I'd like some space, or I'd like some human contact. Desire, things we want. So there's this notion that desire and desire meet. They're like seeking each other out like magnets. That makes people seeing this screen. And so when you want something, even if it's a physical thing, really your physical desires are spiritual desires deeply. When we want something, we want connection, we want comfort, and actually those thoughts or moods ascend through this thing. And so all of these things that God have created are constantly floating up. They're not circles on a page. they're moving up. They want to ascend, and so do we. You know, we want meaning, we want elevation, we want. So this is a version of the Buddhist question of like life being unsatisfactory, or dukkha, right? The notion that everything is always disappointing. And here's a Jewish response to that, saying all desires always want to ascend, right? Like you're always feeling like you want more and slightly unsatisfied. Everything, that's actually not a reflection of the fact that life is temporary, but a reflection of the fact that God's desire, our desires rather, all desires want to ascend because they're a manifestation of God's desire. That there's a deep connection that we're always longing for metaphysically, which is why those things happen. And they do that secretly. You don't know it. You don't know that your desire for a chocolate chip cookie is a secret manifestation for the unity of the universe. You don't know that, but it's true. All right, you know what? Enough here. Let's come back to the end of this teaching next time. We'll pick this up and then move to a slightly less esoteric piece on the Hebrew alphabet, which is a great classic as well. Where all of the letters audition to be the first letter in the Torah. It's one of my favorites. They come before God in audition. And with that, any questions or comments? So what was today's class about if we had to summarize in one sentence? Anyone help me? Gosh.
Unifying the upper and the lower.
Unifying the upper and the lower worlds, or the hay and the hay in God's name. You know, God's spiritual reality that he creates is empowered by our ordering or creation of our physical reality. Our desire to improve the world here, our desire to deal with the difficulty of the world here is animated by God's energy, but also it adds to it. It connects with it. When we try and do what's good, we're not just acting on a physical level. We're embodying something deep and connecting with God in the same sort of action, all represented here by the letter Hey. Today's episode, like Sesame Street, was brought to you by the letter Hey. And I thank you all for tuning in. It's also brought to you by Elisa and Andy, who generously co-sponsored. If you want to, you can do that in the link, bethshalom.org, and always make a donation to sponsor this class, and we will plug you. But also brought to you by the letter Hey. Thank you, everyone. Wishing everyone a great week. And next week, we'll be back at it. Tuesday, just a promotion, it's Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the Omer. And together with Rabbi Eliyahu Klein, the great mystic of Providence, and Rabbanit Avital Engelberg, we'll be doing a thing on Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. 3 takes on the relevance of Lag BaOmer in the coronavirus era. Wishing you all well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yishkoah.
Hmm.